or ineffective topology. You might recall, right, that last class I asked you to think about some of these steps. A force indicating a device might be to say something like, I'm sorry, or to really provide a clear acknowledgement. Explaining what it is that that person did wrong, right, is the second step. If somebody says, I'm sorry, the other person might say, for what? And if you show that you understand what you did wrong, that's an important way that a good apology can be developed over time. Taking responsibility, right, taking ownership, owning up to the issue. Promising repair or a fix to the problem that you see as being able to impact the relevant communities is important. And a promise of forbearance, the ways that you'll be able to take that responsibility and address that longer term, right? So we looked at the example last Friday of Bill Clinton's apology following Monica Lewinsky scandal, right? And one of the things that came up that was really interesting is over the course of that entire apology in text, he never says the words, I'm sorry. And one other interesting oversight, right, is there's not a lot of targeting the apology toward people who might be directly impacted, right, such as Lewinsky herself, wife, and so on. So there's some issues there in what might be present or missing in those steps of an apology, right? So a fake Kardashian apology might not necessarily offer an explanation of responsibility or an offer of repair. So if an apology seems fishy for you, it might be because it's missing one of those parts. And obviously, these ideas are important for conflict management because we're going to screw up, right? We're going to say or do things that are hurtful for the other person. So when we're thinking about the long-term health of the relationship, especially toward people close to us, that strategy is a really important one. So last class, on Friday, we talked about the study circle reflections. Again, all of your grades in the course are up to date. So the only thing left is your term paper and then the extra credit. We talked a little bit about apologies. We'll be getting more into forgiveness and reconciliation for today. I heard a group that was talking a little bit about Travis Scott. And that's actually a case study we'll be doing for today on the issue of forgiveness and reconciliation. It's pretty current. Another current and relevant example, right, is that if you have followed the stuff going on with Alec Baldwin following the shooting on the set of Rust, right, he's taken to a lot of programs and talked about how he is not responsible for the shooting. And you can think about that as a non-apology and the issues of things like agency, responsibility, and so on. We also talked about some examples of public apology, too. So for this class, we'll kind of talk through forgiveness, what forgiveness is and is not, and the differences between forgiveness and reconciliation. So I want you all to remember the examples that you were working on within your groups at the beginning of class, because a little later today, I'm going to ask us to return and think about the ways that forgiveness and reconciliation could connect to these examples as well. As a couple reminders, so extra credit is due by the end of the day this Friday. The prompt's on Canvas. I'm asking you to get in touch with an organization that does some level of conflict management, mediation, or reconciliation work and report on that experience. Again, on the 16th from 1 to 3 p.m., you'll take some time to informally share your progress toward your final essay. Again, some possible questions to guide your informal discussion is, what is your topic? How has your topic changed or evolved over the course of the last several weeks? What have you learned about conflict management through the process? What are some questions that are still coming up for you, for things that you want to explore a little bit more? What have you learned from the experience? So you don't have to answer those questions exhaustively, but those are some starting points if you're a little unsure of how to go about sharing your work. And again, it can be completely informal and conversational. If you can't come face-to-face, please come through Zoom. I'll be posting a Zoom invite for you next week. If you can't come through either of those, I'll ask that you send me a short 4 or 5 minute video before this date so that I can display that for you. And then lastly, please complete the instructor course evaluations as soon as possible if you haven't already done so. You should have received an email on information for doing that, and it's available to do on Canvas. Again, that's super helpful for me, and I take your feedback really seriously, both in terms of things that have gone well and things that I can do to adjust and change this in future courses. I know some of you are taking some classes with me in the wintertime, so it's helpful for me to know, what worked well and what I can do to support you going forward. Again, this final draft is going to incorporate those outside at least 2 scholarly publications, and then also at least 5 of the major concepts talked about toward the back half of the class. That could be in areas like negotiation, in mediation, apologies, forgiveness, and reconciliation, organizations and families, as we'll talk about later this week, as well as issues like aggression, bullying, and so on. So there's probably at least a few ideas that we've talked about that would connect to your exam, such as the way that forgiveness or reconciliation might have brought about an end to a major conflict, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, or the way that things like aggression might have played into the conflict as well. So there's a lot that you can draw from and use here as you're gearing up for your final revision. And again, I'll look at outlines, drafts, and so on. So one of the major questions, right, is this idea of what it means to forgive. So we talked a little bit about forgiveness last class, and I want to get into a little bit more detail there. One of the most common phrases that we hear discussed a lot is the idea that we forgive, but we never forget, right? And that's an important distinction. Forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. Forgiveness is about the ways that we remove our grudges or negative feelings that we have toward other people, right? When you forgive, it's not that you have gotten this idea, this negative experience completely out of your head. It's that you are now at a better place with that person where you're able to look past that, or you're able to incorporate what happened while still maintaining a relationship with that person. Forgiveness is interactive, right? It's one person is doing the forgiving, but it's based on the relationship with that other person. And, right, there are a lot of challenges in choosing not to forgive. In fact, there are a lot of situations in which somebody might make the choice, either presently or into the future, to not forgive somebody else, right? And there are ways that we can acknowledge and think about that, both as forgiveness takes time, or as the, offense or issue is so egregious that it might not be worth forgiving. So as an example, probably one of, if not my favorite TV show, is BoJack Horseman on Netflix, right? And there's this entire plot point of the show, and I enjoy it because it's an animated show and it's kind of silly, but it gets serious and dark sometimes. There's a character, right, who comes out as gay and gets fired from his job, and main character, right, does not defend him or does not stand up for him or does not lead with him. And so there's an interaction where forgiveness does not happen because of resentment and frustration, right? That this character did not feel supported and emotionally is not at a place to forgive. So while it's important to talk about forgiveness and the ways that forgiveness can be a really good thing, right? Forgiveness does not always happen. And it's important to recognize some of those spaces where forgiveness does not work out. And offering ways to provide support and assurance for people despite those issues coming. So, wanted to share a clip from that again is a little bit serious, but gets at some of the ways that forgiveness might or might not happen, depending on the situation.
Hey, buddy! You come back for that Vitamix?
Oh, you should get that looked at.
Yeah, I've been meaning to see a doctor.
Hey, I wanted to talk to you about, I feel bad about what happened.
So, you're apologizing?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay, I don't forgive you.
Herb, I said I'm sorry.
Yeah, and I do not forgive you.
Not sure you get what's happening here. This could be the last time that...
No, I'm not going to give you closure. You don't get that. You have to live with the shitty thing you did for the rest of your life. You have to know that it's never, ever going to be okay.
I really think that we'd both feel better if we
I'm
just...
dying. I'm not going to feel better. And I'm not going to be your prop, so you can feel better.
You have to believe me. I did everything I could.
Yeah? Then why didn't you call me? Huh? 20 years. You didn't call me.
Look, I wanted to, but I didn't
You know
think.
what it was like for me? I had nobody. Everybody left. I knew all those showbiz phones would turn on me, sure. But you?
It's not my fault you got fired.
I don't care about the job. I did fine. I had a good life. But what I needed then was a friend. And you abandoned me.
Right? So kind of dark, but an example of the ways that like forgiveness does not always play out or happen the ways that we wish it did. So oftentimes if we feel like really deep resentment or challenges towards somebody else, then we're going to reach a point where we're not in a place to offer forgiveness. So again, I thought it was kind of an interesting example of how forgiveness can and cannot happen. If you ever saw the Melissa McCarthy film, Can You Ever Forgive Me? The premise of the film, right, is that her character is creating like fraudulent material. For instance, like here's a book that's signed by the author, and she forges the signature, right, and makes an entire living and a bunch of money off of that fraudulent behavior. And in many ways, the film is about her trying to atone for and respond following that information becoming public and the social, legal, and so on consequences that that brings, right? If you ever read or saw the Ian McEwan film, Atonement, that's another example that gets at the role that apologies and choosing to forgive or not to forgive can play a pretty big role. So as we're forgiving somebody, right, if we are the forgivee, if we felt wronged or hurt by somebody else, and we're trying to make a decision on whether or not to forgive somebody else, there's a lot of different phases here. One of them is uncovering or outing what the source of forgiveness is. So what is the thing that they're upset about, and why do I feel upset about that thing, right? So the video example, right, the character, Herb, who's dying of cancer, right, is talking about how he felt like he didn't feel emotionally supported for a very long time. A decision is another step, right, where you're making a choice as to whether or not to actually forgive the person for the thing. So the decision is an important choice that's essentially make or break. Again, oftentimes forgiveness can take time and it can take work, and forgiveness is something that might not happen sequentially, right? One example that really comes to mind for me is that there was a former member of the U.S. House of Representatives named Anthony Weiner. You might be familiar with the story a few years back. He basically started sexting and lying about that extramaritally, and he had this whole big public apology. And then a couple years later, right, he's running for mayor, and he's done it again, right? So a lot of times we feel like we're less willing to accept an apology if it's come up again because we feel a breach of trust in that person. They're continuing like a pattern of behavior without a real genuine effort to change. So work, or putting in the effort to emotionally deal with the challenges that might come in forgiving and moving on with the relationship, is a really difficult issue. And then the outcome of, at the end of the day, choosing to forgive or not plays a big role too. In the context of couples counseling, right, if somebody has violated like an agreement, like cheated on a partner in a monogamous relationship, right, that process of forgiveness is one that we might see at play here too, as an example of applying or using that. There's a couple different models too that kind of come out as some contrasting approaches of thinking about forgiveness. So you might think back to the Hawker-Wilmot and Ware's conflict map. Those were all different ways of deconstructing conflict that are focused on different elements. In the same way, these are a couple different models that emphasize different steps or issues related to forgiveness. Worthington's approach is really focused on the way that the process of forgiving connects to things like emotional vulnerability, right? So if for your case study, for your paper, you focus on an issue that involves some level of forgiving and reconciliation, you might think about how that relationship does or does not involve some of these five steps. What's oftentimes really hard, and a reason why people might not forgive, is because the hurt and the impact of that experience is traumatizing, right? We might lock it away and bury it underneath Empathizing is another important step, right? Thinking about that other person's perspective. The role of intentionality can play a really big role too. If somebody did not intend to hurt, but happened to do so, that's an issue. The altruistic gift of forgiving. So the idea is that to forgive is very much giving a gift. It's giving a chance to somebody with knowledge that they could hurt somebody, right? Oftentimes we'll commit to forgiving. So one strategy that you can use to forgive effectively is to make some type of commitment. Tell a friend or somebody close to you, I'm going to forgive this person. Or, I'm going to try and be at a better place with this person, and sharing that with somebody else. And then holding forgiveness, right? So sometimes a relationship feels violated, or people feel uncomfortable if somebody has been forgiven for an action, but it comes up in a way in the future that suggests that they never really forgave. And so the line between forgiving and forgetting is a pretty difficult one to manage, right? That somebody can forgive, but they might still feel some level of resentment or frustration. So dealing with that in a constructive way is important. The Waldron and Kelly approach sort of is less about the feelings and the guiding sort of emotions, and more about trying to think about the logical approach to forgiving. So that's another way of thinking about this process that you might consider. So rather than reflecting on the hurt, this approach says we've got to confront the transgression. We have to deal head on with the issue that might have come up, right? So confronting the idea of an extramarital affair, saying or engaging in words or actions that were hurtful to others, and so on. Managing emotions, right? So this approach suggests that emotions can be managed, which, depending on the culture or background, you might or might not agree with. Sense making, right? Making sense of, trying to understand or figure out, what it is that happened is an important step too. Seeking forgiveness, the idea that you want to be forgiven for what you did. Receiving or being granted forgiveness is an important element too, right? That forgiveness is granted on you in a somewhat similar way to it being a gift. Negotiating or thinking about the values and rules. So what rules were violated? What norms have changed? Or what's gone differently as a result of this relationship? Maybe you are less socially close to that person, or there's a way that the relationship has become closer as a result of dealing with this issue. And then a transition, right? The relationship is not the same, but there's things that you've learned or things that have allowed you to move to a better place. So again, we can think about these kinds of models to forgiveness, oftentimes in interpersonal, particularly one-on-one situations like verbal disagreements or arguments. But the goal here ultimately in both of these models is to break patterns of behavior in how things like transgressions can happen. Another key idea here, and again, something that has kind of been a through line throughout the course, has been talking about rule of culture and the way that culture lets us understand some of these issues in a new light. You might recall earlier in the course, we were talking about the idea of a locus of control. Locus of control being the level of belief you have that you can manage or have autonomy over your life. So an internal locus of control means I'm in charge of, or I can control my actions. External means, I have little free will or ability to alter the course of events. So individualistic cultures, like the United States or Australia, tend to be a lot more focused on an internal locus of control. You're in control of your own actions. As a result of that, oftentimes, if you're a victim, right, or you're somebody that has experienced something hurtful or something you believe needs to be forgiven, oftentimes we'll focus a lot more on the offender's responsibility and agency, that they made a choice to hurt you, or that they have some ability, right, to fix or right the wrong, that they have a lot more ability to do so themselves. Whereas in a more collectivist culture, right, there might be a greater focus on the idea that culture, the background and the upbringing of the person, plays a bigger role in how that person has behaved or acted over time, right? So culture can play a big role in how we view individual responsibility when we're seeking forgiveness. But there's a lot of differences, as we mentioned last class, in culture in choosing to apologize. You might recall that in more collectivist cultures, such as Japan, there's generally a much greater focus on not providing excuses or explanations either, which ties back to the idea that if you don't feel a lot of personal agency or responsibility, right, in the same way, that there's less opportunity for excuse. So if that's forgiveness, right, and forgiveness is about one person going through those steps and going through that labor in order to get to a place that's more constructive, the goal of reconciliation is essentially to mend the fence, right? You can think about it. There's a lot of different metaphors that we use to describe reconciliation, a surprising number, and a lot that are interestingly tied to nature. I'm sure there's a whole paper about that. But mending the fence, burying the hatchet, water under the bridge, right? It's getting to a more constructive place with that person. So if apologies is focused on the person who did the wrong thing, forgiveness is focused on the person who is at the receiving end of the bad thing. Reconciliation is about creating that bridge between the two and creating a better place to mend the fences, to build a more positive relationship overall. And again, a big goal here is this idea of reestablishing trust. The big reason why that's a concern, right, is the fear that the thing that happened that was hurtful would happen again, right? If you think back, like biologically, right, we have a kind of survival instinct, and we're likely to be averse to things that we see as directing harm for us, right? It's the, I see somebody else who ate the berries and that killed them, so I'm not going to eat the berries too. It's, I associate this person with hurt, therefore, I need to make sure that I'm not feeling that hurt again. And that can be really challenging in the context of relationships, and there are times that that doesn't work out, right? One example, if you, as another case, right, of infidelity, the kind of infamous situation with Tiger Woods, right, where he was cheating, and then he was like being chased with a golf club. He and his wife at the time, right, attempted to work through the process, but they were not able to reach an agreement, and they did end up divorcing. So not every case of reconciliation is going to work out. So, as a way of thinking about the reconciliation process, in the United States, basically the most formal process of reconciliation would be going to court, right? And we've noticed this in a lot of some of the higher profile cases, such as, you know, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Kyle Rittenhouse case, right? There have been a lot of cases that have gotten a lot of significant national attention. But another thing that we know, right, is that court is expensive, court costs a lot of time, right, and it can be really emotionally exhausting, and by the end of it, you could end up in a really negative situation. So when we think about justice through reconciliation, courts are clogged, right? They take a lot of time to go through cases, to receive witnesses, and a jury, right? Oftentimes, the entire process of going through court is very, very long, very, very tedious. So, over time, including in the United States, there was a focus on, well, if we're able to resolve this conflict without using court systems, then we're able to create less clog to the courts and reach a better, more speedy solution to the problem. So the focus on restorative justice in particular has become a really common practice. So, kind of the difference between these is that retributive justice is focused on harm and punishment toward the wrongdoer, right? Again, if you've ever read The Scarlet Letter, right, Nathaniel Hawthorne, the premise of the book is that a woman has committed adultery and has to wear a gigantic letter A on her chest, right? That's retributive. That's focused on some level of punishment or harm that's directed toward the person. in the hopes that that serves as a deterrent to that person, that it serves as a social signal that that person has done wrong, and that it also serves as a signal for other people not to do the same wrong thing, right? But we've also seen a turn toward restorative justice, which rather than punishing the wrongdoer is a lot more focused on addressing the harms that the victim or survivor experienced and providing them with support, right? So restorative justice is about how do we fix the problem and help the communities that are impacted to feel a loss of trust or feel the negative effects of the issue. So one example of this is a VORP, Victim Offender Reconciliation Program. So I've even looked, and there's a couple that might be based on, in the state of Oregon, it might involve, Eastern Oregon, an area to explore for your extra credit opportunity. But there are some formal organizations that focus on conflict management and how victim offender groups are working together to provide that kind of restorative support, to say, this hurt and this impact happened, how can we develop a framework for people to better work together to resolve the issue? So, as I mentioned before, you've probably seen the example, right, of Travis Scott in the news. This is, a famous performer who, in one of his concerts, right, the audience was so clustered together and it was so kind of poorly managed that multiple people died due to the suffocation that occurred as a result of that experience. So, right, Travis Scott has generally been on the hot seat ever since in terms of apologizing for that action and also for the role that his own kind of responsibility has. So there's been a lot of criticism directed toward him for his apology, whether or not he's gone far enough in support, timeline, and all of those things. So there's a lot of opinions about whether or not his apology has gone far enough or has been supportive in the ways that it's needed to be. But a major focus here has been on things like forgiveness and reconciliation, ways to avoid or deal with the patterns of behaviors that might occur. So here's an example of his
I just want to send out prayers to the ones that was lost last night. We're actually working right now to identify the families so we can help assist them through this tough time. My fans really mean the world to me, and I always just really want to leave them with a positive experience. And anytime I can make out, anything that's going on, I just stop the show and, help them get the help they need, I could just never imagine the severity of the situation. We've been working closely with everyone to just try to get to the bottom of this. City of Houston, HPD, fire department, everyone to, help us figure this out. So if you have any information, please just contact the local authorities. Everybody continue to just keep your prayers. I'm honestly just devastated. I could never imagine anything like this just happening to me. I'm gonna do everything I can to keep you guys updated and just keep you guys informed on what's going on.
Right, so this goes on a little bit longer, but the general gist of this apology is very focused on not only acknowledging sort of the harm that happened, right, in case of the Astroworld performance, but also, reconciliation to kind of be seen through, we want to get to the bottom of this. There's an effort to direct people toward resources and funding that might be able to help to identify people involved. Scott has since offered to pay for funeral expenses for people that were killed as a result of the incident too. So there's a lot of ways that, examples like this one that we see of these issues coming up also focus on the formal steps that somebody might do in order to try to address and lead to a better long-term solution. So we can kind of see some examples of reconciliation in action. So what I'd like us to do now, and some of the remaining time that we have today, is to return back to the groups that you used in the start of class And the example that you came up with in your group, whether it was the Kardashians or the YouTube apologies and so on. And so using the example that you shared and talked about in your groups, what I'd like you to do is write or type one per group. What would it take for somebody to forgive this person or group for whatever it is that they've said or done? Right? If you have a general example, you might think about a specific thing that they're apologizing for. So what would it take for somebody to forgive? And then secondarily, what would reconciliation look like? Right? So who would need to be supported through the reconciliation process? So keep using that example that we talked about earlier in class and think about how it might link back to both forgiveness as well as reconciliation. So take some time to chat about it and then write or type one per each of your groups. Okay. So I'd like to hear again from each of the groups, and in the group what I'd like you to do is just to share how might forgiveness and reconciliation connect to this public apology example that you talked about here at the beginning of the class. So let's go kind of through the same order again and start up here with this group.
What it would take for someone to forgive this person would be them actually like putting in the effort to change and to be better, and having their apology be genuine and not like scripted or fake, and also making sure that they don't repeat the action that they
Yeah, right. So in the case of a YouTube apology, I think being the more tangible you can be about the specific action you're doing to correct the problem, the better, right? If you can point toward things that show that you're going to do better or you're going to prevent this from happening again, I think that can help a lot, right? In the case of Scott, it might be doing more to create concert venues that are, up to protocol and aren't too populated to create something like suffocation, right? How about this group here in the middle?
What we said it would take for people to forgive is like time, because like just this controversy was like in the midst of like the whole COVID situation. So I felt like everybody is starting to listen about COVID, then he should be more like, okay, probably kind of like out of hand.
Right.
Also just kind of generally try to change, and if we were to ever like, if COVID ever got serious again, so it's like not do it again.
Yeah.
And for reconciliation, it's like his fans are the ones that were supporting him, so like, and then because like his tour was canceled, so the people that were technically supposed to work at his concert, like didn't get the job, so they were able to earn that money.
Right.
So kind of that as well.
Yeah. All really good examples of some of the specific things that happen. This group here.
We talked that the Kardashians need to first admit what they did wrong, because a lot of times they just apologize and they don't need to say what they're apologizing for. And then it would need to be sincere. And then also, I don't think they could be forgiven until they see a behavior change from them. Like even them saying, okay, I'm gonna do this to get better, but I think they have to see it first. Like see it to believe it. And then fans that need to be supported, because of course they support a lot of the Kardashians, and then whoever they affected and hurt would also be supported.
First step is admitting you have a problem, right? And lastly up here.
So we talked about the celebrity, and so earlier Stormy mentioned that she showed that she was wanting to learn and educate herself to grow from the experience. And so she had to, it was pretty much offending a group, like people of color, that she offended with that group. And so she had to, like, I don't know. 'Cause I don't know the whole story, but she pretty much just had to understand like where they were coming from their perspective, and see how to fix what and what.
Yeah. right? Taking the time to grow and figure those problems out is really important. I really appreciate you all sharing these good and engaged and thoughtful examples. Talked about some of the challenges of forgiveness and reconciliation for today. For Wednesday's class, please read chapter 1. We'll talk about issues of conflict management in organizations and families. So please pass forward your activity today for your group or email that to me if you did it through email. Have a great rest of your day. Stay safe out there and enjoy the snow. And I will see you all again on Wednesday.